The dry oak spokes of the wagon wheel let out a piercing shriek as the iron axle snapped with a sickening crack. The heavy cart lurched violently sideways, slamming Eleanor Whitaker against the rough wooden railing. Her breath left her lungs in a sharp gasp as 38 silver dollars spilled from her worn leather satchel, tumbling and flashing like lost stars down the steep limestone slope. Below her, the narrow trail dropped sharply into a rocky ravine where jagged boulders waited like silent judges. The frightened horse kicked wildly in its harness, pulling the tilting wagon closer to the edge with every desperate lunge. Eleanor did not scream. She had learned long ago that panic solved nothing on this unforgiving land. With white-knuckled hands, she gripped the brake lever and threw her weight backward, her boots digging into the floorboards. The sharp scent of crushed cedar horse sweat and dry Texas dust filled the air. For 3 terrifying heartbeats, the wagon hung suspended between survival and disaster, swaying like a pendulum over the abyss. Slowly, painfully, she coaxed the trembling gelding back onto solid ground until the cart groaned and settled against the rocky bank. She leaned her forehead against the horse's damp neck, feeling the rapid thud of its heart match her own. At 38 years old, Eleanor Whitaker had already buried a husband and buried too many dreams. Now she was returning to the only piece of ground that still felt like home, Barrow Ridge. It was October 1883 in the Texas Hill Country. For 2 long years, a merciless drought had baked the land into cracked clay. Rivers ran thin, pastures turned to dust, and small homesteaders were packing up in defeat. But Eleanor had come back anyway. By late afternoon, she guided the limping horse and patched wagon into the quiet settlement of Cedar Hollow. The town was little more than a wide dirt street, lined with weathered storefronts, a blacksmith's forge, and the Cedar Hollow feed and supply. As she tied her horse to the hitching rail, the heavy rhythm of hooves announced the arrival of the region's most powerful man. Harlan Beckett reined in his big bay stallion beside her. At 45, he was broad-shouldered and sun-hardened with steel-gray eyes that had seen too many hard seasons. He owned the sprawling Beckett Ranch that dominated the fertile valley below. His gaze took in Eleanor's dusty traveling dress, her mended cloak, and the quiet determination in her posture. "You're Silas Whitaker's granddaughter," he said, his deep voice carrying the slow drawl of Texas ranch country. It wasn't a question. Word travels fast. "You're wasting your time up on that ridge, Mrs. Whitaker. The land's been dead for years. Nothing but rock and regret." Eleanor met his eyes without flinching. "It's Miss Whitaker now, Mr. Beckett, and that land belonged to my grandfather. I aim to make it mine again." A low chuckle escaped him, though his eyes remained serious. "With what? You can't run cattle on stone, and you sure don't look like you've got the money to fight this drought." "Then I'll find another way," she replied softly, turning toward the store. Harlan didn't ride away immediately. He lingered, watching her disappear inside, a flicker of something curiosity, perhaps even reluctant respect, crossing his weathered face. He had expected a grieving widow ready to break at the first hardship. Instead, he had seen steel. Inside the store, Eleanor spent nearly every dollar she had left on a decision that would set the whole town talking. Rather than buying a few head of cattle she couldn't feed, she purchased a neglected herd of 155 feral hogs from a trader passing through. They were lean-scarred, half-wild creatures no respectable rancher wanted, considered nothing but crop destroyers and nuisances. Among them was an old sow with one torn ear, who seemed to watch Eleanor with unusual intelligence. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cedar-covered hills, Eleanor drove her unlikely herd up the winding trail to Barrow Ridge. The cabin her grandfather had built stood weathered but stubborn, its porch sagging, and the hand-dug well long dry. She unpacked her few belongings by lantern light and sat at the old oak desk in the corner. There, tucked inside the drawer, she found what she had truly come for: 11 leather-bound journals filled with her grandfather Silas's careful handwriting. While others saw worthless dirt, Silas had spent decades studying the hidden rhythms of the land. As night settled over the ridge, Eleanor stepped outside. The 155 feral hogs had settled down, but not near the cabin. Instead, the entire herd had moved with quiet purpose toward the high western limestone ledge. They pressed close to the cracked rock face, as if listening to something only they could hear. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter and walked among them. She knelt and placed her bare palm against the cold stone. Deep beneath the surface, she felt it, a faint, steady vibration like the slow heartbeat of the earth itself. Her grandfather had been right. The land wasn't dead. It was only waiting. But as she rose to her feet, the distant sound of a single horse's hooves echoed up the trail from the valley. Someone was coming. And in the Texas hill country where water meant survival and power meant everything, Eleanor knew her real battle was only beginning. The morning sun had barely crested the cedar-covered hills when Eleanor stepped out of the cabin, her boots crunching on the dry limestone gravel. The events of the previous night still lingered in her mind, the strange vibration beneath the rock and the sound of hooves that had faded into the darkness without anyone appearing. She pushed the unease aside and focused on the task ahead. Today she would begin digging for the lifeblood this land so desperately needed. She hitched the patched wagon and drove down to Cedar Hollow where Caleb Thorne waited outside the feed store. The broad-shouldered driller in his mid-50s had kind eyes shadowed by worry. His daughter had been ailing since the drought worsened and the medical bills weighed heavy on him. When Eleanor explained her plan to drill near the western ledge, he nodded slowly. "I remember your grandfather, Miss Whitaker," Caleb said, wiping his hands on a grease-stained cloth. "Folks called him a dreamer, but he understood this hill better than most. I'll bring the steam rig up this morning. Won't be cheap, though." "I know," Eleanor replied quietly, "but some things are worth the risk." By mid-morning, the clatter of the steam-powered drilling rig echoed across Barrow Ridge. Caleb and his small crew of 2 young hands had positioned the equipment exactly where the feral hogs kept returning. The 155 hogs refused to graze elsewhere. They circled the rig site in a loose, watchful formation, the old sow with the torn ear pressing closest to the limestone. As the heavy iron bit began pounding into the rock with rhythmic, deafening thuds, Eleanor stood nearby, her grandfather's journal open in her hands. The pages described hidden fissures in the limestone that trapped moisture deep underground. She glanced at the hogs again. They seemed to sense something the men could not. News of her endeavor spread quickly through Cedar Hollow. By noon, a small crowd of curious onlookers had gathered along the lower trail. Some shook their heads in pity, others laughed openly. "That widow's lost her mind." One man muttered loudly enough for Eleanor to hear. "Buying wild hogs and drilling on dead land. Beckett ought to put a stop to it before she wastes what little she has left." Among the skeptics was Jeb Beckett Harlan's younger brother. At 22, he carried the family arrogance without the wisdom that tempered his older sibling. He sat tall on his horse, smirking. "She'll be broke by the first hard frost," he called out. "Then that ridge will belong to someone who knows how to run it." Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the rig, refusing to give the Mockery any power over her. In the early afternoon, the sound of lighter wheels on the trail brought Maeve Donnelly. Her old friend, a widow herself, climbed down from her buckboard carrying a basket of fresh cornbread and a jar of preserved peaches. "You always were stubborn," Ellie Maeve said with a warm smile as they embraced. "But I worry for you. The talk in town isn't kind. Some say you're chasing ghosts like your grandfather did." "Maybe I am," Eleanor admitted, accepting a piece of cornbread. "But I feel it, Maeve. There's something here. The hogs know it too." She gestured toward the herd, which had settled into patient vigil around the drilling site. As the afternoon wore on, the rig reached 30 feet, then 40. The steam engine chugged steadily, but the deeper they went, the more the men's expressions tightened. Dry shale and hard limestone, nothing more. Eleanor's small tin of silver dollars grew lighter with every hour. The sun had begun its slow descent when the sound of a single horse approaching made her look up. Harlan Beckett rode up the trail alone. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, his tall frame casting a long shadow. His face showed no mockery, only a deep, troubled concern. "You're really doing this," he said, coming to stand beside her. His voice was low, meant for her ears alone. "I told you last night this ridge has broken better men than either of us. You're going to spend everything you have on a hole in the ground." Eleanor met his steel-gray eyes. "And if I find water, Mr. Beckett?" "What then?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the rig pound deeper. "Then the whole valley will have to rethink what it believes about this land. About you." There was something new in his tone, respect mixed with an emotion he seemed unwilling to name. He glanced at the hogs, then back at her. "My father taught me to trust cattle and open grass, but I once believed in maps and hidden water, same as your grandfather. I buried those beliefs a long time ago." Before Eleanor could respond, Caleb called out from the rig. "We're at 60 feet, Miss Whitaker. Coal's burning fast, and your money only covers us to 75. After that—" "Keep drilling," Eleanor said firmly, though her stomach tightened. She felt Harlan's eyes on her, heavy with unspoken thoughts. As the shadows lengthened across the ridge, the pounding continued. 70 feet. The engine strained against denser rock. Harlan lingered, arms crossed, his presence both comforting and unsettling. He did not offer to stop her again, but the worry in his expression spoke volumes. Then at 73 feet, the iron bit suddenly dropped several inches into emptiness. The engine screamed as resistance vanished. A deep groan vibrated through the limestone beneath their feet, not from the machine, but from the earth itself. The hogs surged to their feet, grunting and shifting restlessly. A sharp hiss of air burst from the borehole, blowing fine white dust high into the cooling evening sky. Caleb lunged for the controls, but before he could shut it down, the unmistakable scent of wet stone and hidden water carried on the breeze. Eleanor's heart leaped. She stepped closer, barely breathing. Harlan moved beside her without a word, his shoulder brushing hers. The ridge, which had been silent and barren for so long, seemed to be stirring at last. But as the crew worked frantically to stabilize the rig, Eleanor knew this was only the beginning. Whatever lay beneath the stone would change everything for her, for the hogs, for the doubting valley below, and perhaps even for the guarded cattle baron standing at her side. The true test was still to come. The ground trembled beneath their feet as a deep, rumbling groan rose from the earth itself. For a heartbeat, everything fell silent, except for the frantic grunting of the 155 feral hogs. Then, with a thunderous roar, a powerful column of crystal-clear water exploded from the borehole. It smashed through the wooden derrick, shooting high into the twilight sky before cascading down the limestone ledge in a roaring, life-giving torrent. The air filled with the clean, sharp scent of wet stone and hidden springs. Eleanor stood frozen in awe as the icy water sprayed across her face and dress. Caleb let out a wild shout of triumph while his crew scrambled to redirect the flow. The hogs surged forward, pushing and shoving to reach the newborn stream. The old sow with the torn ear plunged her snout into the rushing water, drinking deeply as if she had waited years for this moment. Word of the miracle spread like wildfire through the Texas hill country. By the next morning, buckboards and riders lined the trail leading up to Barrow Ridge. Former skeptics arrived with wide eyes and quiet wonder. The same men who had laughed at Eleanor's feral hogs now stood at the fence line, watching the water carve dark, fertile channels through the dry earth. One grizzled rancher, a longtime critic, removed his hat and approached Eleanor on the porch. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitaker," he said gruffly. "I thought you were chasing foolish dreams. Turns out you were listening to the land better than the rest of us." Even Jeb Beckett rode up with a small group of hands, though his expression remained sour. He watched the flowing spring with narrowed eyes, but said little, clearly unhappy that a widow with wild hogs had succeeded where so many cattlemen had failed. In the midst of the growing crowd, Eleanor noticed a familiar figure walking up the steep trail on foot. Harlan Beckett had left his stallion tied at the lower gate. His heavy leather coat was unbuttoned, and his broad shoulders carried a new weight of humility. When he reached the spring, he stopped a respectful distance away, taking in the roaring water, the thriving hogs, and finally Eleanor herself. He approached slowly, his steel-gray eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "I didn't come to talk about land rights or water rights," he said, his deep voice low. "And I didn't come to buy what you found." "Then why are you here, Mr. Beckett?" Eleanor asked, though her heart already knew part of the answer. Harlan reached into his coat and pulled out a rolled piece of yellowed parchment tied with a faded ribbon. He held it out to her. Their fingers brushed as she accepted it, sending a quiet warmth through her, despite the cool spray from the spring. Unrolling the map, Eleanor saw intricate hand-drawn lines detailing the underground faults and water flows of the entire valley. It was dated 1868, signed by a much younger Harlan Beckett. "My father built our ranch on force and cattle," Harlan said, his gaze fixed on the rushing water. "He laughed when I showed him these maps as a young man, told me dreams and geology wouldn't fill bellies, so I buried them. I became what he wanted me to be, hard, practical, and alone." His voice roughened. "I lost my wife and our firstborn son to drought fever years ago. After that, I stopped listening to anything but survival." Eleanor looked up from the map, seeing not the powerful cattle baron, but a man carrying deep private pain. "You're not alone in carrying regrets, Harlan," she said softly, using his first name for the first time. "I lost my husband to a riding accident 3 years back. Coming here was my last chance to honor what my grandfather believed in." They stood together in silence as the water continued its steady flow. Harlan's mother, Lila Beckett, arrived later that afternoon in a small carriage. The elderly woman, sharp-eyed despite her years, studied Eleanor for a long moment before nodding in quiet approval. "My son has carried too much for too long," Lila said gently to Eleanor when they had a moment alone. "You've reminded him there's still life in these hills, and maybe in him too." Later, as the sun began to set, painting the limestone ridge in hues of gold and rose, tension flared when Jeb confronted his brother near the spring. You're really considering partnering with her, Jeb demanded, sharing our water with hog farmers and homesteaders. Harlan's voice remained calm, but firm. This water doesn't belong to us, Jeb. It belongs to the land. Miss Whitaker has shown us all what listening can do. After Jeb rode off in frustration, Harlan turned back to Eleanor. They walked together along the western ledge as the evening cooled. He stopped and looked at her with profound respect and something deeper. You didn't try to conquer this ridge, Eleanor, he said. You listened to it. You trusted those hogs when everyone else saw worthless animals. You've made me question 20 years of hard choices. He reached out and gently took her hand. His calloused palm was warm and steady. The valley needs what you've brought here. I need it too. Eleanor felt her heart open in a way she hadn't expected. She didn't pull away. Instead, she squeezed his hand, allowing herself to feel the quiet strength passing between them. For the first time since losing her husband, she sensed the possibility of a future that held more than mere survival. As stars began to appear over the Texas hills, Eleanor knew the water had done more than save the land. It had begun to heal hearts long hardened by drought and loss. Yet winter was coming, and turning this miracle into a lasting legacy would require more than water alone. It would demand courage, trust, and the willingness to build something new together. The late afternoon sun bathed Barrow Ridge in a warm, golden light as spring arrived in the Texas hill country. 6 months had passed since that miraculous evening when the earth gave up its hidden treasure. What was once a barren, rocky plateau had transformed into a lush haven of green pastures and flowing water. The artesian spring continued its steady, generous flow, filling carefully built wooden troughs and irrigation ditches that now carried life down to the thirsty valley below. Eleanor stood on the restored porch of her grandfather's cabin, watching the scene before her with a heart full of quiet gratitude. The original 155 feral hogs had not only survived the winter, but had thrived. Healthy litters of piglets now rooted happily along the stream banks, bringing the herd to well over 200 strong. Their once scrawny frames were now solid and strong, their coats thick and glossy under the gentle spring sun. A light carriage made its way up the trail, carrying Ruth Ellison, a territorial agricultural official from Austin. The woman stepped down with obvious admiration as she surveyed the flourishing fields, the intricate system of flumes and ditches, and the healthy herd grazing peacefully. Miss Whitaker, Ruth said, extending her hand, what you've accomplished here is remarkable. The governor himself has reviewed the reports. Your grandfather's journals, combined with your determination, have created a model for sustainable settlement across the hill country. We're entering Silas Whitaker's writings into the state archives as an example of true land stewardship. Eleanor smiled, holding her grandfather's final journal close to her chest. I only listened to what the land was trying to tell me, she replied softly. The hogs showed me where to look. The water did the rest. As the official completed her inspection and departed with promises of future support, Eleanor noticed a familiar rider approaching. Harlan Beckett guided his bay stallion up the trail with easy confidence. Over the winter months, he had become a steady, welcome presence on the ridge. He no longer carried the heavy isolation that once defined him. Instead, he had thrown himself into helping channel the water to 6 neighboring homesteads, including several of his own outer pastures. He dismounted and walked toward her, removing his hat. His steel-gray eyes held a warmth that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. Behind him, his mother Lila watched from a distance with a knowing, satisfied smile, while Caleb Thorne worked near the barn with his now recovered daughter playing nearby. Even Jeb had begun to soften, offering reluctant help with the irrigation ditches after seeing the undeniable benefits to the entire valley. The wool buyer wasn't interested, Harlan said with a grin as he reached her. But the pork buyers from San Antonio certainly were. They offered top dollar for the spring stock. Seems your hogs produce some of the finest meat in the region. Eleanor laughed lightly, the sound carrying across the greening ridge. Who would have thought those starving creatures everyone mocked would become our greatest blessing? Harlan took her hand, his thumb gently tracing her knuckles. They walked together toward the western limestone ledge where it had all begun. The spring's musical murmur filled the air as clear water continued its journey down to nourish the land. The hogs grazed contentedly below their grunts and rustling a peaceful symphony. I've been thinking a lot these past months, Harlan said, as they stopped at the edge overlooking the valley. About what my father taught me and what I've learned from you. You didn't just bring water to this ridge, Eleanor. You brought hope. You reminded me that it's never too late to listen again to the land, to others, and to my own heart. He turned to face her fully, his expression tender and certain. I don't want to be just neighbors or partners in this water system. I want to build a life with you here, to honor your grandfather's legacy and create something new together. If you'll have me, I'd be honored to call you my wife." Tears glistened in Eleanor's eyes as she looked up at the man who had once warned her away from this very land. "Yes, Harlan," she whispered, "I'd like that very much." They stood together as the sun dipped lower, casting long golden rays across the Texas hills. Maeve Donnelly waved from the lower pasture where she now helped manage the growing community garden. Caleb's daughter laughed as she chased one of the young piglets. The valley below, once cracked and dying, now showed ribbons of green stretching toward the horizon. Eleanor leaned her head against Harlan's shoulder, feeling the steady strength of his arm around her waist. She thought of her late husband, her grandfather Silas, and all the quiet struggles that had led her here. The land had never been barren. It had simply been waiting for someone with the courage to listen, the faith to dig deep, and the heart to share its gifts. As the sky deepened into twilight and the first stars appeared over the ridge, Eleanor Whitaker, soon to be Beckett, knew she had finally come home. Not just to a piece of rocky ground, but to a place of belonging, love, and enduring legacy. The spring continued its eternal song, carrying water and hope down to the valley, a reminder that even in the hardest seasons, life could find its way through the stone and bloom again.